Thank you everyone for joining us tonight in the spring forum for Cayuga Lake Environmental Action Now. My name is Stephanie Redmond. I am the program manager for Cayuga Lake Environmental Action Now. Our first keynote speaker is Dr. Raymond C. Vaughn. He's a PhD and professional geologist and environmental scientist. He'll be talking to us about the salt mine under the lake and what are the risks and options.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, to section number 11. Salt mine under the lake. This is the Cayuga salt mine that's under Cayuga Lake. About 2,000 feet below lake level, or about 1,600 feet below sea level. And the current cavity of the mine is several square miles, extending probably as much as 8 miles from south to north. And mining continues northward under the lake as we speak. Mining being what's called room and pillar mining. This leaves pillars of salt to support the mine ceiling, which is roughly 10 feet high. And the salt between the pillars is then removed, leaving the pillars in place. Just in case you don't know where the map is, where the mine is, it's more or less between the two red lines here at the north and the south, under the lake, with Trumansburg and Ulysses being off to the left, off to the west, and Lansing generally being to the east on the right side of the map here. And Ithaca, of course, is further south than this map goes. So that's where the mine is located under the lake. It's not yet to the northern boundary, not yet to the northern red line, but they're moving in that direction.
This is not even a movie.
No, it's not a movie.
This is just kind of some concept. What's
It's-
control it?
In a
I
moment,
know,
we'll-
it's fine for you, but it's important to Bubba and me.
thank you.
Yeah.
Well, we'll keep eating then. Then you won't pay for it. How's for a plan? What do you think?
So this slide shows a cross section of the lake, generic cross section, with Cayuga Lake being the very dark blue and its lake bottom sediments in purple, occupying a bedrock valley from which the rock has been eroded out by rivers and scoured out by glaciers. So the layers of rock salt, hundreds of millions of years old, are intermixed with layers of shale and dolostone. And the mining is actually being done at the very bottom here. So the medium blue band is where the mining is located. This is the mine layer here, deep down, as I say, about 2,000 feet below land surface. So one of the things that happens with any subsurface mine is that subsidence happens. Whenever you have a cavity that's subsurface, the overlying weight of rock, for any deep mine at least, is just too great for that cavity to stay perpetually open. So, as I mentioned already, the mining's continued northward. We've got the room and pillar mining, with the pillars holding the mine ceiling up. But I say the pressure of the overlying rock is just too great. Over time, the mine cavity will gradually close. So year by year, decade by decade, the pillars are becoming shorter and fatter. And as the pillars deform, the mine is slowly squeezing shut as the ceiling and the land surface move downward. This is a diagram actually for a coal mine with the same general principles apply. You can see at the very bottom, the coal seam is here. The mine collapsing. You can see the floor lift in the mine. The other layers above the mine are gradually bending, breaking, shearing. So at the land surface, you'll get a little bit of subsidence occurring. It's usually on the order of inches rather than feet. Depends partly on how deep the mine is. But it's particularly a problem if one side of your house goes down a couple of inches and the other side stays up. So it's that differential settling that is often associated with subsidence. It can be a problem on the land over a close mine. Here, of course, we're talking about water being over the main portion of the mine that is currently being mined. So this is just a summary of what I've been saying. The pillars deform, the mine slowly squeezes shut. And it's typically a slow and gradual process, but there have been examples of sudden collapses occurring. One being Cargill's Avery Island mine in Louisiana that resulted in fatalities when the roof collapsed there just a few years ago. Back in 1994, closer to home and more geologically similar to us here, the Exo mine in Livingston County, New York, collapsed. No fatalities, no injuries, fortunately, but that led to unstoppable flooding in 1994, extending over into 1995. That was in an embedded salt geologic setting, much more similar to what we're dealing with here as compared to the Avery Island mine. But with the Exo mine, the geology is fairly similar, except for the fact that there was no lake atop the mine there. So on the left, you can see the Cayuga mine here. On the right, you can see the Exo Retzoff mine. Both were located in bedrock valleys. The difference being that the bedrock valley in Livingston County was generally filled with glacial fill. Here, the glacial valley is filled with Cayuga Lake. So the unstoppable flooding that the Exo mine experienced was actually flooding from aquifers and a tiny bit of surface water from Little Beards Creek, but nothing like the immense volume of water that would be available if there were a sudden collapse of the rock beneath the lake above the mine, creating a direct pathway. That is obviously a very important difference in terms of water supply. So one of the things I'm talking about today is risks. And one of the risks is that mine flooding will bring relatively fresh water into the mine. This may be water that floods in either because it's being deliberately put in after the mine is shut down, or because of an unexpected, uncontrollable collapse of at least part of the roof, which creates a pathway from higher lying water flow down into the mine. This question of deliberate flooding, it's a practice that's sometimes done with a closed salt mine. And that's a big decision that's going to be coming up in a few years, or at some point, if and when Cargill stops mining in the mine, what will happen to the mine? Will it be left filled with air? Will it be left filled with water? It makes a big difference in terms of the fresh water that goes in and the brine that comes back out. So the big question is, as you can see in blue here, is the mine squeezes shut over time, the brine is squeezed out, but where is it going to? Is it going up into Cayuga Lake and thus making the lake water saltier than it already is? And will there be health effects or ecological effects? And will they be localized or lake-wide for the lake? The risk, of course, can be much worse if a sudden collapse occurs, but even without that type of sudden collapse, there's the question of what happens with the water that flows into the mine and comes back out salty. So one of the options, and really the main option I want to talk about today, is this question of whether mining under the lake is worse than mining under land. Should, for example, the mining be shifted under Lansing or under the Ulysses rather than under the lake itself? It's not a completely black and white question, and it really needs to be done with the advice of an environmental impact statement. But in terms of the reasons for thinking that mining under the lake is worse than mining under the land, it's important to recognize that mining under the land has thicker and stronger rock above the mine, so you have greater resistance to collapse. And if a collapse does occur and you're under land, there's no direct vertical pathway. The water would need to move down, downward from the lake, for example, move sideways some distance. That adds a great deal of resistance or creates a much less likely pathway than if the mine as now continues under the lake. So this is a question that applies either to sudden collapse or simply slow flooding, either slow leakage or deliberate flooding, where a mine under land has no direct vertical pathway, as I was saying, to a freshwater lake like Cayuga Lake. But one of the options that also needs to be discussed is what are the existing mine cavity plans? Can the mine be sealed if and when the mining stops? Or if it's deliberately flooded, what is the plan for that? Good. Next one. So I'm not just talking about this to hear myself talk. New York State has the SECR law, the State Environmental Quality Review Act. It requires an environmental impact statement be done if there may be a significant effect on the environment. One would think that the mine certainly qualifies for something that may have a significant effect on the environment. At the very least, the question of future releases of solid brine into the lake from the mine. So preparation of an EIS would look at risks and options, usually in the language of SECR or SECRA. These are called impacts and alternatives. And in any case, preparation of an EIS would provide an opportunity for public comment. Yet despite the expectation that an EIS would be done for any project that has or may have a significant effect on the environment, Cargill has never prepared an EIS and DEC hasn't required one. There's another salt mine in New York State that's actually done two, but by comparison, Cargill has not done any for the Cayuga Lake mine. Next, please. So why no EIS? Cargill and their consultants have done many studies, such as running seismic lines above the mine and interpreting the results. And these are studies that are intended with good reason to evaluate the mine stability. And they're exactly the types of studies that would and should be done as part of an EIS process. The problem is that Cargill and their consultants treat their studies as confidential. They shield these studies from being seen by the public or by experts working on behalf of the public. There really ought to be a process, and there are well-known processes where confidential information can be shared with a few experts, keeping it shielded still from the public, but having a few experts working on behalf of a group such as CLEAN should have access to material like this. So far, that has not happened. The question, of course, is can these confidential studies be trusted? And I have no reason to deny entirely that they're untrustworthy or to say entirely that they're untrustworthy. But it certainly makes a big difference in terms of public trust and in terms of getting expert agreement with the interpretations being given, for example, by Cargill, or also the interpretations that any well-informed geologist and geophysicist and engineering expert would understand. So just summing up on this particular point, there's currently no access. These are study results that need to be available for independent review, both by the public and by third-party experts. Studies to date, as I said, may indeed provide good answers to some of these mine stability questions, but it's not information that we're allowed to have. But if there's nothing to hide, why hide the existing studies? And indeed, based on currently available information, there are some specific concerns about what's been withheld to date. And then there's the ongoing problem of no closure plan for the mine. If and when the mine closes, what will be done with it? What will the impacts and options be? And the big question I'm emphasizing today is the question of whether to flood or not to flood once the mine is closed. So the reason that closed mines are sometimes flooded is that flooding is apt to reduce the rate at which the mine squeezes shut. The weight of the overlying rock will be partly counteracted or resisted if there's actually a cushion of water, so to speak, with it. But the process ends up filling the mine with very salty brine. What happens is the water would tend to go in as fresh water, but the mine still contains a lot of unmined salt, certainly including the pillars that are holding the ceiling up. So fresh water coming into contact with pure salt pillars, there's plenty of opportunity there for the water to dissolve salt from the pillars and from any other unmined salt that's present in the mine. And the result will be that the brine fairly quickly will become fairly saturated, would fairly quickly become fully saturated brine. So it may go in as fresh water, but it's going to come back out as brine as the mine squeezes shut. As I say, the water pumped into the mine may well slow down the process of mine squeezing shut, but it will not stop it entirely. So the question, just to repeat, where would the brine go and what effects would be on the lake? Now, if the mine is left dry and essentially sealed upon mine closure, could it stay dry forever? I think that's pretty unlikely, so. It's not exactly a clear-cut choice between flooding a closed mine and leaving it air filled. Especially at that depth, the water pressure is very large. And the slow flow of water through any small cavities and crevices will continue to bring some amount of water into the mine. Especially as subsidence occurs, the overlying layers of rock are distorting and creating, to some degree, new openings, or at least enlarging old openings. So even if the mine is closed to dry, it's likely to have slow leakage, maybe even fast leakage. They'll tend to flood the mine over time. Again, these are impacts that really should have been looked at before the mining proceeded, but with it well underway, it's still a very important question as to what happens with the closed mine. It certainly is the type of decision that would require an EIS if a DEC is paying attention to the needs of looking at some of these environmental issues. Is there some possibility the mine could be backfilled with a non-toxic material? That seems like rather a tall order. Would you bring in huge amounts of gravel? What would you do to fill a closed mine? You would not want to fill it with some of the things that people would like to pay to get rid of, like garbage, but beware of what might come along in terms of proposals. So these are some of the types of questions that an EIS should be addressing along with mine stability questions. So I've already talked about this quite a bit, but the two clear lines of evidence that mining under land may pose less of a risk are, first, the layers of strong rock known as the carbonate beam are mostly gone and maybe completely gone in spots along the center line of the lake. So this strong beam of rock remains in place under land and under the lake. Excuse me, it remains in place under land around the lake, but within the footprint of the lake itself, the carbonate beam, this strong layer of carbonate rock, is largely missing. So again, this is something that needs to be looked at in the context of an EIS. So the top cross section I've already shown you. What I've done in the lower one is simply emphasize that same drawing, filling in with yellow colors the rock layers that are designated the carbonate beam. This is a term that Cargill and its consultants and also DEC and also us agree on. There is this relatively strong layer of rock. But you can see how the bedrock valley, filled with both the blue lake water and then the underlying sediments in the stippled red-pink color, those have really cut down into the carbonate beam under much of the cross-section of the lake, especially right along the center line. And, it's getting down to the point where the remaining rocks between the bottom of the bedrock valley and the salt mine are relatively weak rocks. The interbedded salts and dolomites and shales are not particularly strong, nothing like the strength of the carbonate beam. So that's what's missing, obviously, under the lake, especially under the center of the lake. And as you can see or can imagine to the side, that carbonate beam is not cut down into under the higher land, either east of or west of the lake. The second reason that mining under land has evidence in favor of being safer than under the lake is that any water pathway, either a small existing pathway enhanced by subsidence or a new collapse, will have a less direct flow pathway, as I've already emphasized. So this is, again, an obvious difference that needs to be assessed in an EIS process, along this question of whether flooding is going to be done or not. There's also a question of whether existing studies have correctly recognized the mid-valley loss of the carbonate beam strength. And again, this is just precursor to this drawing. It was actually done by a couple of geologists, geophysicists up here, working on behalf of CLEAN. They've simply redrawn the profile A drawings I just showed you. And you can see here their diagram showing that there's less than 80 feet of thickness above the top of the Syracuse. But more importantly, for the point I'm making here, is that the bedrock thickness above the mine, as shown by Cargill and Cargill's experts, is less than 800 feet. Yet DEC had relied on their consultant to do an assessment back in the year 2002, 21 years ago, looking at the estimate of whether the Cayuga Lake mine is going to be stable when we compare it to some of the measurements for the failed Retzoff mine, the actual mine in Livingston County. And the crucial point here is the upper circle here showing bedrock thickness of 800 feet as a minimum. This is what DEC's consultant had used as a comparison to the 600 feet of the failed Retzoff mine. As I showed you a minute ago, the 800 feet is not actually true. There's spots where it's much thinner than that, ranging down to the low 700s. Certainly not 800 feet. It's less than 729, probably more like 709 feet to be compared to the 600 feet of the failed Retzoff mine. This is an error that affects both the bedrock thickness and the pressure arch height to width ratio in the table from the Boyd report that I showed you a couple slides ago. So the logic of saying, oh, the thickness of the bedrock carbonate beam is sufficient still to do the job does not hold up when looked at closely. So in fairness, DEC's consultant, the Boyd company, did properly note that more thorough analysis would be needed for the areas of bedrock thinning before mining enters these areas. But nevertheless, the professional opinion of Boyd that DEC relied on was still based on these incorrect values of the minimum bedrock thickness and arch ratio. So getting toward the end here, if existing studies correctly recognize the 5 thin bedrock anomalies, and also the fault that's under the lake known as the Frontenac Point anomaly. The thinning bedrock and the resulting loss of strength in rock above the mine occurs in 3 different ways. One is that, as I've continually emphasized here, the bedrock above the mine becomes relatively thin at the center of the lake, just because the bedrock valley is gouged out most deeply at the center of the lake. But also the second point here is that the bedrock above the mine thins northward. This is something that's seen throughout the Finger Lakes area, and indeed much of upstate New York, where the rock layers dip southward, and thus they rise northward toward the land surface. So as Cargill is mining northward, the salt seam or salt bed that they're mining continually rises toward the land surface at a rate of about 80 feet per mile. So obviously, once you get up toward the New York State Thruway, up toward Syracuse, the salt layers are actually at or near the surface. And they obviously cannot continue to mine that far north, but as they continue from their already questionable location northward, this is a question that needs to be considered more and more seriously of the bedrock thinning northward and thus rising northward toward the land surface. But on the number 3 point here, in the 5 locations that Cargill and DEC refer to as anomalies, the bedrock valley has been more deeply scoured than other locations. So there are places where the glacier, not smoothing the rock entirely smoothly into long, smooth curves, is actually dug slightly deeper pits, as they might be called in certain places. And everybody, including DC and Cargill and ourselves, refer to these 5 locations as anomalies where the bedrock valley has been more deeply scoured than the valley in general. And of course, there's also a fault near Frontenac Point that needs to be taken into consideration. So here's a map that shows the anomalies A through E from north to south. They're represented as ovals. This is a map that was done on behalf of Clean, but based on accurately copying Cargill and DEC reports. So you can see that the company's own reports actually vary quite a bit in terms of the exact size and shape of the ovals A through E. So the more serious question here, though, really involves the Frontenac Point anomaly. You can see the FBA oval here adjacent to the D anomaly, but the FBA, remember, is a fault, not just an area of thin bedrock. So faults always involve some breakage of bedrock. It may well have been breakage in the distant past, but nevertheless, you don't have the strength of unbroken bedrock where a fault occurs. So it's important to know where that fault is. And here we see an even larger discrepancy in its size and shape as compared to the differences in the ovals from the different reports. So this is about the same view, but without the other anomalies. We're just looking at the Frontenac Point anomaly with a 1,000-foot buffer drawn around it. The Frontenac Point anomaly is drawn as an oval, which is true on the last map I showed you as well. But this is a map that was done and issued by Cargill. This is a map that was prepared in 2016 by Cargill's expert, their consultant, Respec. What you see now in red is how the Frontenac Point anomaly was represented in that 2016 map. So is it this or is it this? These are actually superimposed fairly well, even though the boundary information looks a little bit different, but it's got to be one or the other. It would be good to know in terms of having independent experts assess whether it really is something depicted as an oval or something that is present, deep underground as a fault that needs to be avoided. But if it is a fault, it's important not to mine under it. And it is a fault, there's general agreement on that. Given that, it's a good idea to know the size and shape of the fault, particularly whether it's linear, oval, and most importantly, what is the evidence, one way or the other. And of course, similar caution is needed on the anomalies as well. The studies that have identified these thin bedrock areas shouldn't be withheld. They should be available for review. So wrapping up here, what's the closure plan? Mining can't continue forever. What happens afterward to the underground empty space? And what is the decision process? Will there actually be an EAS involved in the decision process? So as I've emphasized, this is an important decision on whether the mine will be deliberately flooded. But even if it's not, modeling or other types of studies are needed to try to figure out what will happen with the water that does come back out as brine. And as I've said, salt mines gradually squeeze closed, the surface subsidence occurs. In the process of doing that, the water or brine, as it becomes after being in the mine for a while, will be squeezed out, leaving questions of both the fate of the brine and also whether to shut it dry or not. And then just wrapping up on the point about whether mining under land involves less risk. Yes, if the carbonate beam remains intact under land, and yes, there's far less risk of a major water brine connection between the lake and the mine under land. And the risk of mine flooding and collapse really does depend greatly on recognizing and avoiding mining either close to thin bedrock anomalies or close to faults such as the Frontenac Point anomaly, the FPA. And with the issued reports keep showing differences in the size and shape of the anomaly and the fault, these are issues that really need to be addressed in an EAS. So thank you, and I'll take some questions now, and then we can have other questions later. Yes. I don't know the answers completely. Some of the other members of CLEAN may have this. There is some good guidance from the collapse of the EXO. For a few years, greater flooded. Parents companies were required to retreat. The history there is kind of interesting. I haven't done it. When the EXO mine collapsed, it took a little over a year for the flood to complete. What happened over the next few years was that the brine that was present in the mine, freshwater flooding, salt fillers, it did not appear to be going anyplace. Same things. It's salt water, saturated brine is heavier than fresh water. So that's actually expect brine to stay down. When you get fresh water down, brine kind of sink it up. But in the early 2000s, it became apparent ongoing testing of Axo, the brine was migrating. Axo, the company, and your insurer required to. After a few years of that, Axo and their insurance company protested, saying, why should we do this? Why does it matter? And the $20 million settlement in the state of Axo. In a sense, it's different because having large percentage of fish water. That'll maybe give you a slight sense of what the insurance limits might be. Settlement price payment. Should not have specifics. I don't. Yes, judging is technical information. Something their material that Axo explained is privileged and confidential, not being available. I don't usually.
I'll speak to this.
Yes,
I have a couple questions regarding the closure plan. So I presume because one hasn't been filed and one hasn't been requested, that one isn't required. Is that safe to assume?
it's a little bit.
Can you repeat the question for people on Zoom?
I have two questions regarding the closure plan. Since you said that one hasn't been filed, one hasn't been requested, one is required. And the second question is also regarding your standard operations. Cargill is an international mining company. Presumably, you knew something about their experience of standard practices in other parts of the world or other mines, and what's happened there. When and if they close.
I think Ryan will get into some of this in his talk. But part of the question is, part of the issue is that there's not a comprehensive view. Mining systems. There's very little. My best understanding of this one. They were in certain is it just says what needs to be subsurface.
Within final application, suppose a reclamation plan, if you have a gravel or sand, whatever, you're supposed to file a reclamation with that. And generally, a reclamation plan for an above ground mine is, recreating the site and seeding it. But there's only two examples of underground salt mines in New York State. One of them collapsed, and they didn't require them to provide any information. They filed for their permit on their closure plan. Do we know anything about what Cargill done in other mines? Parts of the world? Well, they have 3 other mines. I think John will be taking here about this. There is if you go online, there's quite a bit of information. There's a group in DC that produced a report. Cargill is the worst corporation in the world. Might want to go there and look at that. So we don't know what they do. Well, John knows about it.
Yeah, we got some questions on here.
Okay, so yeah, Ray, you should come up and look at these questions. So in 2020, actually December 2021, 2 miners were killed in the Avery Island mine, which Cargill was operating. It was one of 3 Pillar salt mines. Within about 2 weeks of those deaths, Cargill announced they were closing that mine, and one of the reasons they closed it was they were having problems with water entry. The people who were killed were part of a grouting team. They had a full-time 24-hour group of men who were trying to keep water from leaking into the mine. Basically said, you know, we're done. So the mine was flooding slowly, and then Cargill just said, we're going to flood it. And apparently the state of Louisiana didn't say no. And so it's as we speak today, it's already been flooded, but all the equipment, you know, it's so when you flood, you know, an industrial site with equipment, workshops, oil, debris, maybe human waste, some of that's going to begin coming up into the aquifers later on. So it would be much, much more expensive if the state of New York said to Cargill, no, you can't flood this Cayuga mine. However, Cargill is already flooding, storing what are called shaft leakage waters on the level 2 mines. So many parts of the level 2 mine are now too unstable for people to go in there anymore. But Cargill is still pumping water into these ponds. And so Cargill's basically trashing parts of the mined out areas by storing water in them. Under the lake, there are 2 mining tunnels, which they are beginning to put shaft 4 leakage waters into, tunnel 60 and 58. So those areas have much higher humidity. The salt, you know, the ceilings begin to sink more quickly down to the floor. Anyway, where's Ray? Ray, do you want to answer questions that have come in online?
I can read it if you want. So we have a question from Peter Mantius. Based on what you know about the mine, can you estimate the likely useful life of this mine? When will someone need to finally decide whether to fill the mine or leave it empty? And who would make that decision?
Thanks, Peter. I would just say sooner than later, and DEC, I think, would need to be the party to make that decision.
You had another one about does Cargill even recognize DEC's jurisdiction? They did not years ago. And the mine is on state land, from Bill.
That's a little bit outside my expertise, but it's always been my understanding that some questions have been raised by Cargill like that.
And from Bill again,
Can't hear you back.
are this property taxes on the mine under the lake on state land? This. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't know. These are questions, I think, for the later speakers.
Any other questions?
Thank you, Dr. Raymond. Okay, we've heard a little bit from Dr. John Dennis. He's one of our founding members of Cayuga Lake Environmental Action Now. We can hear from him more with a talk about Cayuga Mine. Do miners have adequate egress from the mine as required by federal law?
Thank you, Stephanie. And I did want to add that just a little bit more about Ray Vaughn. He's soft-spoken, but he's very organized, but he also worked in the Attorney General's office for a decade in Buffalo. So he has an incredibly good understanding of environmental law. And so he's sort of a Renaissance man in some respects when it comes to environmental issues here in New York. And in one question, just to add a little bit more, Cargill has posted $3.5 million of what's called financial assurance, which is, Brian can probably explain how that's different from an environmental bond. But the reason that, you know, here's a lake that if a resource economist were to do a valuation on Cayuga Lake, I'm confident it would be in the tens of billions of dollars. So, you know, what is wrong with this picture? Here's the largest private corporation in North America being required to, you know, basically what they spend on coffee on a given day to protect our lake. And the reason is, Brian can go into the statutory agreement between the DEC and Cargill, but Cargill basically said, we don't recognize your authority to supervise our work underground. Above ground, fine, you can come and look at, dust issues above ground. So that 3.5 million is really all about maybe taking down a few buildings, cleaning up the surface of Portland Point, and planting grass. It has nothing to do with, there is a 2-paragraph closure plan in a 2002 document. Literally about 2 paragraphs. It says, cleaning up the surface area and plugging the shafts. Now, and it does not, as I recall, does not say whether the shafts have to be filled from top to bottom, because 2,000 feet of a, 30-foot wide shaft is a lot of material, or whether just a plug gets put at the top. But because those shafts are leaking, they're cutting through aquifers, water is dripping down into them. Presumably plugging would be more involved than just a plug at the top. It might be filling the whole thing. Anyway, moving quickly to, this may sound like a rather narrow area. Do miners have adequate egress from the mine? And just a full disclosure, I've thought for many years that it was a mistake to have allowed mining under one of our Finger Lakes, under any of our Finger Lakes. Cargill also owns a solution mine at the bottom of Seneca Lake. Seneca Lake is many times more salty. Stephanie will get to this in her presentation for reasons that aren't clear. The old reason, sorry, Stephanie, if I'm encroaching on your topic, but the old idea was, oh, Seneca and Cayuga are much deeper than the others, so they're so much closer to the Syracuse Formation that salt is just sort of naturally oozing up into these lakes. But anyway, Stephanie will probably put the kibosh on that idea. It has a lot more to do with actual mining activities and road salt. So hopefully I'll figure out how to advance the, there's the up arrow.
Oh, not working.
Not working. So just keep touching that one.
There you go.
So a little bit of history before talking about Cayuga Mine. Cargill owned the Belle Isle Salt Mine, and in 1967, a U.S. Bureau of Mines engineer asked Cargill to provide fire protection for shaft stations and sink a second shaft to this mine, which was in Louisiana. And about 6 months later, a fire broke out, killing all 21 miners who were in that mine on that shift. 20 of them died of carbon monoxide poisoning. The other person had a serious skull fracture. And then 11 years later, 5 miners died from an explosion. In 1984, Cargill closed the mine, and I've searched diligently to see if there's any record of a second shaft ever having been built, and I haven't found one. It doesn't mean that it didn't get built, but as far as we know, another 16, 17 years went by from that request in 67, and Cargill didn't bother to build a second shaft, which is basic mine safety. Miners need at least two ways to get out of a mine to be, safer than that one. And so they closed it in 1984, which coincidentally is the year that Cargill decided to start mining under Cayuga Lake. So I think every time Cargill closes a mine, they either have to decide, are we going to shut all our mines down and just get out of the salt business? I think there's a story that they only got into the salt business because they had iron ore trucks going in one direction, railroad cars coming back empty, and somebody said, hey, we could put salt. Anyway, there's some story that they sort of got into the salt business, not really wanting to do it anyway. But in 2020, when they closed Avery Island Mine, I was hoping they would throw in the towel and say, we're done. This is too many, it's too risky. It's too, but I think what in fact happened again, like in 1984, that there's more pressure to produce more salt from this mine. And I just have heard more train whistles, seen more trucks coming out of the Lansing station. I'm going to pick up the pace here. So a simple analogy, this is a picture of a interstate highway in Utah, 2 southbound lanes on the left, 2 northbound lanes on the right. There's also an exit ramp, but you can imagine if a vehicle was disabled in one of those southbound lanes, traffic might still flow through the other lane, but it would probably be slower. Police would be, directing people around the crash. But if a crash closed both lanes, maybe police would find a way to route traffic over to one of those northbound lanes. But there are times when, if there's a very heavy snowfall, my son lives in Utah. He has about 3 feet of snow on his roof right now. So it's possible that, that highway, there are times when interstate highways do get shut down for one reason or another. So this analogy, here is what's called Northwest 3. This is a small portion of Northwest 3, the south end, and those black dots you can see in that horizontal panel. There are, each one of those dots is a small yielding pillar. So there are 4 parallel rows of those pillars, and in between them are 5 what I'm going to call lanes. But one of those lanes has a big conveyor belt, which is bringing salt and sending it all the way to Portland Point. So that leaves 4 lanes similar to our interstate highway. Now, is it likely that more than one of those lanes would be blocked? And the answer is yes. A cave-in might immediately block 2 or more of them. If a fire happened in any one of those lanes, Cargill does store explosives, oils, they have workshops. If a fire started, there might be smoke, heat, carbon monoxide, there could be an explosion, there could be methane gas. So the law that I'm going to talk about it's Title 30, CFR is Code of Federal Regulations, Parts 57, escapeways and refuges. So on the back of the maps I've handed out, you can see the full paragraph A, but a key sentence: damage to one escapeway shall not lessen the effectiveness of the others. And then there's a brochure that the Mine Safety and Health Administration has issued, which explains separate escapeways cannot share the same pathway. And unfortunately, Title III, at least when I look for it, there's no definition of a passageway. So I think what Cargill and their attorneys and maybe the MSHA inspectors who are down in the mine 4 times a year, sometimes for weeks at a time, they've all agreed that each of these lanes is its own passageway, that they are independent, and the effectiveness of one will not be affected by problems in any of the others. And that is, in my view, just totally unscientific. When you study, one of our consultants is John K. Warren. He's an Australian expert on evaporate mines. He has a volume about 1,800 pages thick, and he has a whole chapter on evaporate mine collapses. So we know quite a bit about, what it looks like when these things happen. Here is a larger view. Let's see, where is my laser pointer? So I was just showing you this section of Northwest 3, but over here, this is a mining tunnel, and it comes up and then runs down here. That's the distance of about 3 miles. There's only this one tunnel. Admittedly, it's got more than one pathway. It may have 4 pathways, but 3 miles is a long ways to have to travel. And here it goes under Anomaly B, what used to be Anomaly B back in 2010. Cargill shrank most of the anomalies in 2017 without revealing to the public why it shrank them. But this is a place where failure could happen. And if it did, these workers would have no alternative way to get past here if there was a big collapse here, blocking all 4 lanes. Oh, and let me give one interesting story about shrinking anomalies. So this anomaly C shrank from this larger circle down to the smaller red one here. I think it shrank by about 45%. And then maybe a year later, the DEC gave them permission to mine under it. And then lo and behold, the next mine map that Cargill published, suddenly the anomaly C was not only as big as it had been in 2010, it was 5% bigger. So I think someone in the law department said, it's no longer serving any economic purpose to have shrunk it. Let's just put it back where it used to be. Anyway, so a few conclusions. Shaft 4, which cost, I think, at least $15 million. Cargill just opened it last year, so that's a sign that they plan to be here for some time. It does provide a shorter commute time. Not sure where my there it is. And that's a good thing. It's cut off about half an hour of travel time. So we think Cargill and the MSHA inspectors are making a mistake when they deem each of these interpillar lanes as a separate escapeway. This needs to be looked at very carefully. We need to contact Secretary Sue at the Department of Labor. And lastly, we should look at this shrinking of anomalies issues. Where's the evidence? We want to see those studies on which it's based. Any questions? Sarah, you're looking curious. Yes. So Sarah asked if there is a union for Cargill's miners. The answer is no. There had been an attempt to unionize and that failed. The other room and pillar salt mine in New York State is unionized, the Hampton Corners mine, which is run by the American Rock Salt. They're a local corporation. They've done two EISs since they started in 2001. Cargill's owned this mine since 1970, so twice as long, never done an EIS. They've done some studies which they say are sort of the equivalent, but unfortunately they're not really. Any online questions, Jamie? Are you looking for them?
You got a thank you. Oh, where is the U.S. Bureau of Mines?
So I think that entity doesn't exist anymore. So that the U.S. Bureau of Mines was in the Department of Interior, which deals with natural resources. And for some reason, the federal authorities who regulate the mine are now in the Department of Labor. So when they go down in the mine, they're looking around. Is everyone wearing a hard hat? Is the diesel particulate matter, below a certain level? Is it safe to breathe the air? And in fairness, they are looking at the ceiling of the mine. Is there are there any, hanging pieces of salt that may fall and kill somebody? So they're looking at electrical connections, whether the insulation is good. So they're sort of detail people. They're not asking about risks to Cayuga Lake, or should it be flooded or not flooded. So when the Cargill officials say we're already regulated, the feds are down there 4 times a year. Well, yes, they are, and they're probably doing a reasonably good job, except for ignoring the escapeway issue. But he only comes to the mine once a year, as far as we know, to go into the mine. There is one person who's assigned to supervise the mine. I think he comes down a few more times than that, but they really don't have free access in the mine at will. There's a formalistic 1 day a year when their consultant, who's based out in Washington State, flies in, and he's here, and they also go to Hampton Corners on that same week of the year. Any other questions, Jamie? Or maybe it's time to pass over.
Bill kind of asked something. He said, what about the new shaft, no environmental impact statement?
I think we actually did a small Article 78 about that very issue, trying to force DEC to demand an EIS on the Shaft 4 project, but Cargill divided it into 2 projects. One was to build a nearly 1 mile tunnel from the lake to where the shaft would be. And when they applied for that, they just said, it's just another shaft. Or something like that. I don't remember the exact. And then later they applied. So they broke it into 2 pieces, which is, we think, was sort of a way of saying, hey, we're only expanding the mine by about 52 acres. And then later, well, we're also going to put in an air shaft because, air is good to breathe. Who can complain with that? And later, now it actually could move salt out. It's a full scale, I guess, 12-inch diameter shaft.
What they call segmentation.
What's that?
That what they call segmentation.
Yes, that is. Thanks for reminding me of that. It did happen, but yeah. So I think that's it. I'll hand over to Stephanie.
Stewardship by the DEC and OGS of the lands owned beneath Cayuga Lake.
Put up the, just the outline. I have no pictures, no slides, I'm just, talking about the, legal and regulatory matters here, so it's not that scintillating, but I want to raise enough, issues for you to, maybe ask me questions later or after the meeting. It's, this is all important, but it's not all that scintillating. So, the Cayuga Lake, is owned by the public, people of the state of New York. The land from the lower water mark and the bed of the lake are owned by the people of the state of New York. And, when the predecessor, Cayuga Rock Salt, was first building the mines, they built mines underneath Ludlowville, and they had to get mineral rights. So they had to negotiate with a lot of landowners. The parcels in that area of Lansing are small. And they thought it would be much easier probably to have one landowner to deal with, which is the people of the state of New York. So in the 1930s, they applied to the Bureau of Land Commissioners to be able to get entry to the lake. It's not they weren't asking for a permit or a lease. They just, you had the law at the time, Bureau of Land Commissioners, you had to ask permission to enter, and in exchange for the permission to enter, you paid royalty payments. So they had about a 10-page contract that was signed in 1938. Had not, as you know, 1938 was a long time before we had people with environmental consideration. So there's nothing in the contract that has any environmental considerations about mine operations and its impact on the people's land. So, and it has gone to this date today, they have a contract, still nothing about impact of the mine on the land, which is, it's kind of silly when you consider how important the lake is to all us folks locally, to not even consider whether you should be actually letting other people use the lake to make money from. So the lake is about, the part that the mine covers about 21 acres under land, 21 square miles, 21 square miles. The city of Ithaca is 6 square miles. So it's a big area that's being mined. And so what do we mean by the people? Well, what's that right? What kind of rights do they get from owning the beneath the lake? Well, there's this public common law public trust doctrine that the state agencies are required to protect the resources for the in the public interest. And you may say, well, we see out west they have federal government owns all these properties, for the people of the United States, but they're being mined, they have oil wells. Well, there's two different ways that this is interpreted. The public trust doctrine, there's the dominant part of it, jus publicum, that represents the public's rights. And then there's a subservient part of that says, that private property rights can be also recognized. And I assume they would recognize a subservient right if you were not doing any damage to the public interest. Here, I think they are doing damage to the public interest. So anyway, the Office of General Services gives them a right to access the land in 10-year periods. And so when the 10-year period, 6 months prior to the expiration of that 10-year period, the grantee is allowed to say, I want to continue mining, and they automatically are issued a permit. There's no environmental review. When we met with the OGS lawyers, they were quite they had consternation that we were asking them about environmental review. Well, we don't have anything to do with environmental. What are you talking about? You know, but it's an action that you're taking. It should have been subject to a secret process. So now we're talking before about mine land reclamation, and that there's no consideration for that here. I mean, we're going to have, you know, a lot of potential salinization of the lake, either slowly or catastrophically. And so how is the trustee protecting our interest if they're allowing mining to continue? You know, no environmental impact statement. It's pretty amazing. I find it very amazing. Anyway, so what are our options? Well, we can convince the DC and OGS of to be more effectively applying their existing regulations. I mean, that's the primary position, you know, mission of these agencies is to protect the public interest in the public lands. You know, Assemblymember Clifton organized a meeting for us with 5 lawyers from OGS, and we provided them with a whole series of documents, and we provided questions in advance. And we had a meeting for an hour and a half. We got no answers to our questions, and we subsequently sent more documents, and we never heard anything. We didn't get an answer to the questions, nor did we get a subsequent letter from them. So on the behest of Anna Cullis, she's asked us to provide her with some more information, especially some proposed regulations, a proposed language for a statute to correct some of the errors that have been occurring before. So that's one option we have. You know, we have the option of having the agencies start to perform better and finding a way to encourage them to do that, or 2, changing the law, or 3, filing litigation. Well, we've done that on several occasions. We were involved for 5 years in 2 Article 78s. And the problem with Article 78s is that the judge defers to the expertise of the agency. So unless you can show that they not only were wrong, but they had to be arbitrary and capricious in their decision making. So being merely wrong about a decision isn't not enough to be sufficient to win. So the other opportunity we have of filing a lawsuit is the new constitutional amendment for the protection of our clean air, clean water, and a healthful environment. And you know, I mean, this is obviously something that's going to affect our ability to have clean water. And so I think it's important that we consider how we might make this work. Standing will be a major issue. You know, how can we show that one particular person is damaged? It was a challenge in a couple of other litigations that I've been involved with. You know, interestingly enough, if you know the the case in Texas with the federal judge, he totally, you know, removed all the elements that are needed for standing. You know, and you know, if that standard is what we're going to be working with in the future, then we certainly will have an opportunity to get to court. And the last thing we can do, if there is a collapse, we can file a natural resource damage claim. In the Axo Nobel, you know, where it was recompensed, the citizens of the county, the citizens of the municipalities were compensated for the damage that was done to their wells, and there was a bridge that was damaged. But it was a very an area of low density, low investment. So 20 million was considered sufficient there. And as John has mentioned before, we're talking about much more serious implications for you know, this community if Cayuga Lake were become salinized in such a way as to, you know, make the water not potable, or the ecology substantially changed to affect the sports fishery and all the other elements that make up the lake. So I'd like, you know, and I'd like to, you know, someone asked before about tax law. Well, there is an ephemeral factoid
the New York State Attorney General issued an opinion that mines located on lands of the people of the state of New York and leased by it are exempt from taxation. So, you know, if you build something underground, it's not going to be taxed. If you build it above ground, it's going to be taxed. And this is only one of many sort of incredible anomalies for that we've encountered in this case. All things that just don't make any sense, but this is the way it is. And we've discussed with the tax authorities about it, and they feel that nothing can be done about it. So anyway, in conclusion, you know, our long experience of failure to stimulate action by the relevant state agencies, it's challenging to identify a path forward. So we're hoping that you'll provide us some suggestions and support. With judges committing to deferring to the competence and experience of state agencies, there's little likelihood that litigation is a pathway to success. Commissioning studies by internationally known scientists has not impressed any of the state agencies. And there are many other people that are concerned in their areas about impacts that are not being adequately reviewed by the DEC. I mean, we're not alone here. And, you know, but we don't have sufficient statewide interest in our work to be able to do something really substantial like that we did with fracking. And, you know, the Greenwich situation, they drew a lot more attention, but, you know, it's, you know, people need to rely on their state agencies to do the work that they were assigned to do. So we need a restoration of the balance between economic development, which is the priority mission of these state agencies, and doing it in a way that mitigates the environmental damage is their secondary mission, but they get really focused on it, that what they make a decision to support a particular project, it's very hard to get them to change. So I'd like to just say one of my experiences I had, many that are frustrating like this, is Love Canal in the 1980s. I don't know if anybody remembers Love Canal, but yeah, you know, the homeowners in that area, their children were getting sick at the elementary school, and they were serious illnesses, blood poisoning, and I mean, you know, life-threatening illnesses for a lot of children. And there were so many that it just seemed very strange that, you know, there were many-fold times what you would expect in this population. So the parents, the mothers mostly, went door to door and they talked to people and they collected all the data, and they were astounded by how many of the children were actually sick. Well, it was come to find out that the school was built on top of the Hooker chemical disposal site. There were 50,000 55-gallon drums disposed, and the school was partially located on top of those. So it's not surprising, but they took all this data to the Department of Health in Albany and said, well, we've gathered all this data, and, you know, we've talked and we have these very strange illnesses that our children are having. And they said, well, listen, you know, you didn't really do a very scientific study, you know, and I'm not sure we can do much with this. So it took years to convince the state that something had to be done. And they did eventually relocate hundreds of families from the site. But even in the most egregious instances, it's just so hard to get these agencies to move. So I would like to say that the amount of uncontaminated fresh water in the world is in steep decline. We very much need to preserve the water quality of Cayuga Lake. Allowing cargo to intentionally salinize the lake is inconsistent with that objective. Or will the human folly continue? Please stand with us to protect the commons. Thanks so much. And any questions? As you can see, I'm much more of a polemical person than our scientist. You know, it's just you know, it's the political work that really makes the change. It would be great if we could convince people with rational scientific arguments, but it hasn't worked too often in the past. So go ahead, Tony.
So what do you think is the most effective path?
Yeah, well, what is the most effective thing that we can do now? Well, I'm looking for suggestions. I mean, hopefully, maybe we'll be able to use this clean air, clean water, and the right to healthy environment to do something here. But it'll take a very difficult work, because I think the courts are gonna interpret standing very narrowly to keep the floodgates closed. So we'll see how it develops over time, but it doesn't seem like we're gonna be able to do anything specifically with the existing statutes and regulations. Louise?
Did I hear you say that Anna Kellis has invited us to give her permission, allow her to help in create legislation? And if so, what might that legislation look like? What's she hoping she can get done?
Well, George, who's a member of our group, is on this call now, and he has been working on developing some language for her. We've met with her, and we provided her with information. She's very supportive. Right now in this egregious budget process, and and the legislators have very little time to give attention to this, but I think once the session is over in June, we'll have the summer and a little bit of the fall to try to work something out, get something to bill drafting at the legislature and get something introduced. But like I said, it takes a lot to get these bills through the Assembly and the Senate. There's thousands of bills, only a few of them make it each year. And so it would take a great, deal of work. Like Greenwich had a lot of people supporting them. They have people from New York City. You've got people, Earth Justice, many of the major environmental organizations. We have never been able to get that much interest from people outside this immediate area. So we need to either do some better messaging, better strategizing, but it's a long haul, and it's a challenging one to get legislation adopted.
So we got some questions online, and if you hand me the mic, I can read them out.
Sure, okay.
So we got 2 questions from Jackie Ross. Are those in communities on other Finger Lakes that could and would be affected by salination being consultant to form a coalition for action? So that's the first question.
All right, well, you might have heard before, John mentioned that the Cayuga is not the only lake that's salinized. But Cayuga Lake and Seneca Lake is the only places where actual salt mining is occurring. The salt mining at Seneca Lake is solution mining. It's not bringing up the particles, but bringing up the solutions and then evaporating the water and getting high quality table salt in place. So I think it's important. Actually, Anna Kellis suggested that we work more closely with the other Finger Lakes. They may not have this exact problem, but we have other problems that are in conjunction with these lakes.
Well,
And
and this is Jackie, and I was suggesting that a salination were to become a catastrophic event, that because Cayuga flows into Lake Ontario, there might be an argument to get some of the other Finger Lakes, Lake Ontario folks, the Finger Lakes Land Trust, the Inns of Aurora, everybody who's like livelihood depends on the lake. It seems like the opportunity for a coalition there could be fairly strong. I live in the Washington DC metro, but have a home in Aurora. And if you need support with communications or marketing with those things, I would love to contribute my support to that, because I think this is a critical issue for the community and for the Finger Lakes overall. Very disappointed in the state.
that's exactly what I'm looking for here. People with new ideas and new energy. It's a pretty egregious thing that's been happening here for all these years, but it just hasn't caught people's attention. I think one of the problems is that it's pretty complicated, the science here, people find it hard to access that scientific information. But I think we need to have that greater interest, a broader interest, if we were able. Because this affects everything in the lake. We're working with the other Cayuga Lake organizations on issues of their concern. I think we need to work together, and I've been trying to do that for the past year. And And we've had a retreat together or a summit last summer. We hope to do that again. So I think it's absolutely important that we all work together to have greater political strength.
And I'll throw one more thing out there. I hesitate to say this as an outsider, not a year-long resident in the area, but I know a lot of people during the pandemic relocated from the New York City area into the Finger Lakes region. And I wonder if using land records, you might be able to reach out to them specifically, speaking of fresh blood and passion about the clean air and the environment in the area. Folks that are experiencing that possibly for the first time might be very strong advocates and have connections back where they came from.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Jackie. I've encountered this in another context of running into a couple of people who moved here from California because of the smoke and the fires.
Yep.
And so, yeah, thank you very much. Another question here.
You guys can't hear back there, right?
Hi, go ahead.
So, plan B, I mean, don't do very well at all, disasters and what companies do go wrong. So I just, not like there's a superstitious thinking like, well, we don't want to do that also. But the plan B, like if it does sound, what is the plan B for the water source for Bolton, when all the other students like this water and drinking?
So for
So-
those of you. Okay.
So anyway, there was a question about a plan B. What happens if we actually do have a salinization increase in the lake and it makes it difficult to use it as potable water? I mean, certainly there's water filtration plants, but all these things are expensive and that doesn't do much for the ecology of the lake. I mean, we might be able to get water for ourselves, but we want to have a healthy lake and that's important to us. But I haven't thought about plan B, but I did think about the natural resource damage claim. If we do have a problem that will hopefully we could get sufficient funding to do a lot of cleanup, but you never are able to restore things to the level that they were initially. If you look at any sort of cleanup programs, I was involved with the state Superfund and the federal Superfund. Actually, Lois Gibbs was the from the Love Canal, and she for 30-40 years was working on cleaning up a lot of communities like East Palestine. I mean, these were occurring all the time during the 80s and 90s because people had no idea that dumping toxic chemicals out the back door of their factory was a problem.
You have one more.
Okay.
comment
All right.
online. You want me to read it?
Sure, one more, and then we're gonna move over.
If you were to pursue a green amendment challenge, have you considered approaching Earth Justice to represent you?
Well, I've worked with them in the past. I mean, there's a lot of demands on their time and energies, but I certainly would consider doing that. Is there one more question in the back? No. All right, well, thank you very much. And yeah, this is not the end of this discussion, so stay tuned.
Should be good.
Okay, great, thank you. My button for going forward, there we go, okay. So Seneca Lake and Cayuga Lake exhibit much higher concentrations of dissolved sodium and chloride than the smaller Finger Lakes do, in spite of similar patterns of land use throughout the region. There's many thoughts about that. It's not definitive that it's from the salt mine because many people would contend that it's actually because the lakes are deeper. But if you look at this next slide, you're going to notice that there's a significant spike around 1960s, 1970s, and that's when mining was in full force in this area. In 1916, the Rock Salt Corporation sunk a shaft. Sunk a shaft to 1,500 feet deep in Portland Point in Lansing, but the salt was of poor quality. So by 1918, the mine was still not producing well and was shut down. And in 1921, Cayuga Rock Salt Company drilled down 2,000 feet to a better vein of salt, which was 99% pure. The number 4 level was mined until 1968, at which point the horizontal shaft with the face being worked on was 2 to 3 miles within the main shaft, and because of the haulage distance became unprofitable. So in 1970, Cargill purchased the mining rights, and so Cayuga rock salt had been bringing all the salt to the surface and dumping it on the land above Cayuga Lake, and so now the salt is screened underground, and only the saleable salt has been hoisted up. So the question is the salt mine actually affecting the lake? And, there might be hydraulic pathways opened up because of the salt mine. And, it could be covered up by this surface operations or road salt in general. But we've noticed that there's a beach well in the northeast section of the lake near Lansing on Bill George Road. And shortly after the mine the mine panel was drilled near there, the homeowner began to realize that there was corrosion of his pipes in his house, all of his intake pipes for his water. And so we came and tested the water from his beach well there, and it was actually at 1,700 milligrams per liter chloride content. So it's not definitive it came from the salt mine, but it looks plausible. So the Environmental Protection Agency considers chronic salt concentrations above 230 milligrams of chloride per liter of fresh water to be harmful for aquatic life, including salamanders, frogs, fish, shellfish, and aquatic plants, and can lead harmful algal blooms as it kills off the algae-eating zooplankton. So also within respect to water quality concerns, the sodium levels of both Seneca Lake and Cayuga Lake remain above the water supply criteria for those on severely restricted sodium diets. Additionally, chloride can trigger the mobility of heavy metals like lead and mercury. I'm sure we're all familiar with Flint, Michigan, in which they decided to stop buying their water from Detroit and started to use the Flint River. Of course, it wasn't the lead in the water, it was actually the chloride that they did, from the lake or from the river. They had not tested the chloride levels of the river before they started utilizing it, and that made the lead in the pipes more mobile. So we have been noticing since the 1980s, you'll notice that there is a slight increase, and the CSLAP data for most of the lakes they test do show a slight increase over time. Cayuga Lake is was around 40 and recently moved up to around 50 milligrams per liter. But I do notice some higher levels when I'm out testing at the north end of the lake, beyond the train tracks there. There's like a bay area where Seneca River comes in and it goes out for Mud Lock. And both of those hover around 100 milligrams per liter. The other thing that I've noticed is that right at the outfall for Cayuga Lake, or for the Cargill surface operations, they often will at the bottom of the water there be at close to 100 milligrams per liter because the salinity sinks. Having trouble with it going.
So fussy.
Okay, there we go. So this does show, even at lower concentrations, we begin to get die off of a lot of different aquatic species. But then, once you get over 100 milligrams per liter, then you start to show significant die off. Fresh water is typically around 50 milligrams per liter, and most streams in Tompkins County experience chloride levels of less than 100 milligrams per liter. This is testing that our group has done. We have a Eureka water probe. It has many different sensors, not just salinity and chloride. This is our chloride levels for tributary studies that we've done. And, most of them are in the low areas. The problem areas that we've seen are Cecil Malone, Renwick Brook, and another one that we lovingly call Hillside Ditch, which is actually coming off of the surface operations at Cargill. You'll mirror similar, conductivity levels as the chloride levels. So this is the Cecil Malone bridge spot. It goes, it's sort of a drainage way for all of these properties or commercial properties. And, you know, it has a lot of road salt coming into there from all of the parking lots in that area. So it's, you know, we would be expecting higher levels coming from there. Renwick Brook also comes down through the developments up above East Shore Park. And so there's a lot of runoff from that area of parking lots and roadways and things like that. Miniger Brook is another one. It's circling the Cargill surface operation. So we see high levels, and the extreme high level was the hillside ditch. And those are coming up with levels of sometimes up to the level of seawater, which is 19,400 milligrams per liter. It continually measures chloride levels in the thousands, but sometimes when it's a sort of a drier flow, we'll get even higher levels. So this shows the surface operations there. You'll see on the left-hand side of the screen, these are all their bulk storage pads. And then on the lower part of the screen, you'll see the offsite bulk storage pads and the brine ponds. And it's sort of to the left of those that is where we see hillside ditch coming down. So that's the one that shows extremely high levels there. And then they're actually allowed to have quite high levels out of their speedies out of their outfalls. Their speedies permits allows them to have 40,000 milligrams per liter of chloride. So more than twice the level of seawater. And there's also an issue with air quality in the area, not just because of the mining, but also the truck traffic in that area. And if you go by on a dry summer day, you'll see just a plume of cloud, you know, of salt that you have to drive through. So this shows the surface operations, an aerial view of that. And we worked with our Children's Earth Foundation and used some of our data to push through a Clean Water Act settlement that was carried by our Children's Earth Foundation. And they are now having to cover up one of their pads that they were storing some salt on. Previously, it was covered with a tarp, but often was left completely uncovered. So we're hoping that'll do at least some mitigation of the surface operations and reduce the salt discharges. So this is their bulk storage pad that they're in construction with right now. So there are options for reducing road salt. As we mentioned, we're speaking with Assemblymember Anna Kellis on some of the regulatory issues, trying to put some amendments in the public lands law. But then the Adirondacks now has a road salt task force. We would like to see something similar in the Finger Lakes to sort of work with problem areas and come up with solutions in problem areas, and hopefully there'd be some funding attached with that. But then looking at transportation laws and also funding small municipalities to be able to get things like brine trucks that reduce the amount of road salt spread across the road. And a big thing is education. You know, we have very little education and outreach, even to larger commercial properties that are using a lot of salt on their you know, paved areas. There's very little out there to tell people to, you know, keep them away from streams or not you know, pile their salt near the streams. And then there's road salt alternatives. But we really want to increase our water protection laws and the regulatory issues that the DEC and the OGS have control of. Okay. As I said, this is Cayuga Lake Environmental Action Now. Here's a link to our website and our Facebook, so feel free to check those out. We are hoping to circulate a couple of letters in the next couple of weeks, one going to Governor Hochul and another one going to, is it Senator Sue? Secretary Sue, sorry, Secretary Sue. And John's been working on drafting those. So look for those online. And as I mentioned previously, we will be hosting or as was mentioned by Brian previously, we will be hosting a summit over the summer. So Cayuga Lake Summit, in which we would like to focus on PFAS as our main topic. Any questions? Yes.
What's your relationship with the Cayuga Lake Watershed Network?
So they've definitely been a great supporter of us, and we've been meeting with them in collaboration meetings, and they're very interested, as well as Cayuga Lake Watershed Intermunicipal Organization. I was very interested in having some further work done to regulate you know, the mine, and also have concerns about road salt being used in general. Yes.
I'm not sure who this is question for exactly, but as a private company, corporation, Cargill doesn't have any responsibility to tell us what their plans are in the future. But John, you speculated because of the new shaft sense that they might be here for quite a while. Do we have any sense for that? And do we have any sense for, again, no one addressed it, but the opportunity for them for somebody to be more aggressive and expand in the area?
I'll let John take that.
Sounds like they could move.
Well, actually, it's one, yeah, so the question is, how much longer is it likely that Cargill will stay? Have we seen any signs? I mentioned that they'd invested at least 15 million to build Shaft 4, which allows them to go further north. Their last seismic study, I was in my motorboat sort of following the seismic boat as it went up the lake, and it stopped at Long Point, which if they did run, if they actually mined, if they applied, we think in the next year or two, they will be applying for expanding their permitted mining area. And if it goes up as far as Long Point, that would be, $2 or $3 billion more worth of salt if it could be done safely. We also know Serena McLeod, who just walked in as an attorney who works for us on a part-time basis at least. Thank you, Serena. And she has checked over at the county courthouse and found that about 8,000 acres of new mineral rights have been purchased by Cargill under land near Shaft 4. So it could be, any day the DEC would say, pull the plug on mining under the lake and please start mining under land. And one of the impacts of that, I suspect, would be that the salt would come to the surface at Shaft 4 and then be shipped by truck. A rail connection would be more difficult, but possible.
Is there not salt under the land now, or is it just easier to get under the lake?
So there's just as much salt under the land. It's, the formation, we do have a slide, but, I can't pull it up, but it runs all the way from Detroit, Michigan to Syracuse, New York. So there's plenty of salt between Seneca Lake and Cayuga Lake and east of Cayuga Lake. But as was mentioned earlier, the part of the hassle for a salt company, if they don't own that surface land. So American Rock Salt owns several thousand acres of their own land, up in Livingston County. So they're mining under their own land. They don't have to fuss with knocking on people's doors and buying mineral rights. Cargill has gotten about 8,000 acres, north, sort of north and northeast of Shaft 4, but they're not contiguous.